the new album based on sort of keywords which are taken from the 1611 King James Bible, or almost extrapolating these words to the modern times of social media, so key buzzwords that people get very extreme views upon. And so in a sense, this is saying that these emotions are the same as they were 400 years ago.
Well, yeah, it's certainly drawing the parallel between human emotions that are timeless. And I started off with a list of words to describe strong human emotions. And I thought I'll write a song about each one of those. And I made a list, and the list, had a lot of bad stuff like anger, greed, jealousy, rage, retribution, and some good stuff like love, compassion, loyalty. And I looked at the words and thought, yeah, I remember reading these. They seem to feature heavily in the Bible. So in a moment of whimsy, I did an internet search for examples of those words in the Bible, just as point of reference and comparison, and copied and pasted some text which sat there as a parallel to songs which pretty much all but one are really about the present day world we live in, or recent history, rather than being necessarily about the Bible. But I make references because it's just interesting to me as a writer to go back and find other points of view that you can use in the way that you would, as a writer, you would use simile, analogy, metaphor. So they serve a purpose in terms of, the biblical text serves a purpose, but it's not, the album is not based on the Bible, nor is it feature any biblical text in the lyrics, although it features some references to biblical text here and there. But I think, I think by and large, I set out to write a song about the world today, particularly in the case of the title track, The Zealot Gene, which is quite clearly about populism, even right-wing populism. And it'd be easy to say, well, it's a song about Donald Trump, isn't it? Because I did write it back in 2017, when he had not long been the president of the USA. But in fact, it was half a dozen other people came to mind when I was writing the song. Half a dozen other national leaders. And so it's quite easy to draw upon a number of sources and to talk about particularly the use of social media in regard to not only political divisiveness, but the social divisiveness that comes from people expressing their views, freedom of speech and all that, brilliant, but try and have a night's sleep after 3 glasses of Chardonnay between getting yourself all boiled up and actually taking to Twitter. It might refocus your mind a little bit after 8 hours of sleep.
In a sense, you think, with the 1611 Bible and now, do you think we're still living in medieval times, really, but with amplified through social media and technology, but really the mindset has never really changed?
I think some things do stay the same, indeed, yes, and it's just they fit in a different way into their historical perspective. And I think with everything, particularly in a politically correct world where we're careful about many aspects of reference that we would not have been careful about in my parents' generation or even earlier in my generation. I think these days we quite rightly consider that we don't want to be hurtful to other people. And so wokeism, as it's referred to, is something that has maybe swung the pendulum a little bit too far in the other direction. I think we've got to remember that there are the idea of cancelling, quotes, Winston Churchill, or even Rudyard Kipling. We've got to remember that there was a period of time, a context of a day and age where a lot of stuff happened that is deeply regrettable. But if you want to cancel somebody, start with that damn President Truman, who decided to sanction the use of 2 hideous weapons against innocent civilians, women and children of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a war crime, as great as any ever committed. And yet he's still perhaps revered by half of the American public as someone who brought World War II to an end. Well, he could have done it by taking the top 3 meters off Mount Fuji. Not that I'm suggesting he should have done, because that has huge religious significance for those who follow the Shinto religion. But nonetheless, there were other ways of demonstrating that awesome power rather than deliberately targeting civilians to see what it would do. And having dropped one, And given they only had 2 bombs to play with, both of completely different designs, they wanted to see if the other one would work as well. So they went and dropped it on Nagasaki and did the same thing again, just to see if the new toys actually worked. I mean, that is absolutely hideous. And, you know, if you want to start somewhere by trying to rewrite history as it is unfortunately still portrayed, then you could do no better than starting with that man and his cohorts. Yeah, I think we've always got to be trying to keep things in perspective, and there'll be people who will say, well, yes, but that was World War II. The Japanese did these terrible things to American soldiers and sailors, and Pearl Harbor, and, you know, we have to kind of strike back. And well, maybe I have to learn to see that in that context, but I find it very, very difficult. And other things that talking about the Bible, for example, I mean, it is full of the most hideous acts, the angry, vengeful God Yahweh, and doing absolutely despicable things to folks who were, again, innocent women and children. It's some pretty unpleasant stuff, but we have to see it in the context of those writers of the Old Testament who were bound by a different set of, not rules, just a different set of awareness, a different set of what constituted the workings of society at that point. So, you know, whether you were the vengeful God Yahweh or you're a slave trader in Bristol, you know, either way, there are things that I guess we have to try and see are part of the historical world that we've inherited, and try not to repeat those. Hence the move towards a liberal society where we're all a lot more careful than we used to be. So, you know, on balance, I mean, it's all for the good, but I think we just have to be careful to not let it swing too far in the direction of trying to wipe out history. We have to remember history. It's there to teach us something, not only about the past, but the present, and very likely the future too.
Do you find your role as a creative person, as an artist, to try and make sense of the madness?
Well, I think it's a question of maybe not making sense, but actually just painting a picture. People can try and make sense of it themselves. In a way, being an observational writer, I think my role is to just put ideas across and make them sufficiently attractive and invitational that people are drawn into a subject. So sometimes something quite dark and bleak, you might even introduce elements of humor in order to lull people into that world that you're creating in a 3-minute or 4-minute song, in order to somehow make it even more poignant. I mean, an example would be the Kubrick movie, Dr. Strangelove, which is played for laughs all the way through, right until the very, very final scene. However, what it leaves you with is a very bleak and frightening sense of reality, especially in a time when Mr. Putin is about to, again, try to recreate elements of history that allow him, in his own mind, to be seen as the great leader of the former USSR, which he clearly wants to try and revive. Of course, he's doing completely the wrong thing, because he's just writing himself an epitaph in Wikipedia, which will be read for hundreds of years to come, and Putin will be the bad guy. I mean, he had an opportunity 10 years ago to actually turn around and begin to think about his legacy in a positive way, but he chose to go progressively in the opposite direction. And it's a sad thing, because I have, like many people, a begrudging respect for Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, because of his strength, his ability to lead, his charisma, and his international ability as a statesman, because he does have pretty strong credentials. But nonetheless, you know, people make decisions, and I think he's chosen the wrong path in that latter part of his life to achieve what his aims are. He should have thought about it a bit more carefully. Anyway, I'm supposed to be in Ukraine in April, so I shall be taking, at the suggestion of a friend of mine, taking my flak jacket, my AK-47. I pointed out that I could not own legally an AK-47 in this country, but I could take one of my legally deactivated other items of weaponry from my past as a member of the lawful shooting community in the UK.
Yeah, because Jethro Tull have always been a very popular band in that part of the world. I'm just wondering if Putin was actually a fan of the band, because I know he likes his music.
Well, you will find probably on the internet, I found it, a photograph of me meeting the then mayor of St. Petersburg, who had a rather evil-looking little man in tow as his, not bodyguard, just his kind of right-hand man. And at that point, Vladimir Putin was a part-time major in the KGB, but he was also the chief assistant to the mayor of St. Petersburg, and I was there doing a concert, and there's a photograph of us standing chatting after a show, and this rather embarrassing moment where Putin is glaring at me because he doesn't like the fact that I'm talking to his boss, and he doesn't like the fact that I'm doing what I'm doing and who I am. So I can think we can pretty much be assured that Mr. Putin is not a Jethro Tull fan, although his sidekick was, I believe, listed amongst his UK favorites, Putin's deputy, who was briefly prime minister of, briefly president, in fact, of the US, of Russia, when Putin had to take a brief spell out in order to run again for presidency. We do have a lot of fans, and I believe it was actually Raisa Gorbachev rather than Mikhail Gorbachev who made a case for releasing the very first Western music to be officially released on the Russian state record label Melodia Records back in 1987. And it was Paul McCartney and it was Jethro Tull. We were the first to officially recognize Western acts. And that was, I think, a reasoned scheme to start taking some of the heat out of the whole thing, to make Western rock music, give it some gentle level of approval and credentials, in a way that acted as a safety valve, and no longer was it necessarily an underground thing, and it just gently started to relax the situation as part of glasnost and perestroika, and we found ourselves really being amongst that echelon of British bands that were invited to perform there, although I chose not to do it at that point in time when I found out that the tickets were only available for sale to the party apparatchiks who, through influence, through bribery, were able to get hold of tickets, whereas regular folks in the street were unable to buy them. So I thought that probably not a good thing to do. Others chose to go ahead and do it, naming no names. But I waited for a while until I was sure that people could actually go out into the streets or the box office and buy a ticket, which, wasn't too long to wait, but another 10 years, I suppose, before I finally visited Russia, which I've done a few times since then.
When these kind of people listen to these songs, and the songs definitely have, strong subject matter and strong opinions in them, do you feel like sometimes a sense of responsibility? Oh my God, who's actually going to listen to this? When you're actually creating them, I'd imagine you don't. You just create the things anyway.
I don't think you can ever really know how people are going to react to songs and lyrics, because I know from my own laziness that I've listened to so much music in my life, but in many occasions I've heard it rather than listened to it, because I've not really digested the lyrics. You hear the words, the sound of the words, the emotion behind it, but you don't necessarily really listen in detail. And if you do, then you form some kind of a picture in your head, some kind of an idea as to what this is about. But in most cases, I think it's going to be very difficult, very different rather, to the image that the artist or the writer had in his or her mind writing the song. So you've always got to accept that no two people are going to hear it in the same way, especially if the lyrics are a little bit more, not complex, but a little bit more evolved linguistically than the average 3-minute pop song that is dealing with usually very common and overworked emotions, which are usually about being in love or being out of love. I mean, that makes up 90% of music lyrics. It all comes back to that. Very rarely does something come forward that is about stuff, about real stuff. There are those who do write about stuff. I think Bruce Springsteen, for example, he is not exactly a raconteur, not a storyteller so much as an observational writer, and I put myself in that category, along with Frank Zappa, who I always revered in the 70s as being someone who was brilliant at characterizations. Unfortunately, he was cruel. He had a cruel and nasty streak about him, which made people laugh, but it's sometimes a bit, it's not really very nice, some of the stuff. But funny for sure, and brilliant in terms of his ability to create characters and magnify them and bring them to life in songs. But they're never songs that are really about emotion, certainly not about his emotion. And that never entered into Frank Zappa's life. I don't think he hardly ever talked about his real feelings, even in interviews. So it was, he was rather divorced, almost like he was a bit dysfunctional in that way. Whereas I'm only partly dysfunctional in that way. I have written a few songs about emotions, but and quite often we'll talk about my feelings about things, but nonetheless, I'm probably on the dysfunctional side of normal, compared to extremes in the opposite direction, like Alanis Morissette, who wears her heart on her sleeve, like one of Madonna's bras. It's just something absolutely in your face and you can't escape it. And much as I think she's I love her songs, great songwriter, but it's a bit tiresome after a while that, oh God, it's that woman who just all the time she's singing about herself again. It's a little bit wearisome, when people bang on about how they feel all the time. At least the blues guys had the ability to talk about emotions, but somehow step out of themselves and make it really universal. I was drawn into the expressions of Black American blues as a teenager, and I think they managed it pretty well to deal with very simple, direct subjects about how you feel. I woke up this morning, blah, 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 and goes on as to, trials and tribulations of life. But somehow it's more universal in a way that I find more endearing. A universal, of course, is an odd thing to describe the stuff of Black American folk music, because as a teenager, when I started trying to play that stuff, it was completely lost to me that I was, as a middle-class white boy, I was imitating something from a culture that I could not possibly understand or rightfully take as a musical future for myself. So I got out of that really by the end of '68. I was by middle of '68, I was, consciously trying to leave that slightly regrettable past behind me and try and forge a future in something that turned out to be called progressive rock.
That's the power of that music, the blues, that it actually could trigger something in somebody growing up in Blackpool, which, as I know from coming from Blackpool, ironically is the least black place you could possibly be in the West, isn't it? I mean, it's the power of that music to actually trigger a nerve is incredible, isn't it?
Well, it was weird in Blackpool at that time, because there was a little record store, just kind of roughly speaking, around behind Blackpool Tower in the side streets there, where we used to go, and they sold music that was definitely not mainstream pop. It was mostly jazz and blues, and the guy who managed the store would let us, reluctantly, he would let us listen to in a booth. You could listen to a record, and if you liked it, you could buy it. But there was no real compulsion other than a bit of gentle pressure to buy what you listened to. I mean, it's akin to sort of going into Marks and Spencer's and trying on a suit, not having had a shower beforehand, and then somebody else has to come in and buy it and wear the suit you've just been trying on in a dressing room somewhere. I mean, it's a bit even worse with a vinyl album. Then you scratch it or do something to, as we know, they don't really last very long. But that was a godsend that we could do that, because we were able to hear examples of music that were very inspirational, to teenagers, 17, 18 years old, whatever we were, 16, 17 years old, probably. And so I was listening to, out of preference, country blues, acoustic blues, Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee and so on. So fortunately, we did have a record store in Blackpool against all the odds. But I think, although we were not really a blues band, when we started off playing, it was like everything else, we were doing covers of the things that other Blackpool bands did as covers of something. But we did slip in some music. I suppose we heard from the Rolling Stones and the Animals and others. We did trace that back to its origins and begin to do our own versions of music that was being played by some of the other British bands. But we went to the root of it rather than just copying them. And so I don't remember there being any other blues or jazz blues band in Blackpool at the time. We lasted there only a few months before we realized we had to move further afield to try and get any gigs. But it was an interesting and competitive world, really. I mean, not that we were vying for the same gigs as Reverend Black and the Rocking Vicars or the Wheels or the other bands of that era, because they had their own followings and played in particular pubs and clubs, and we didn't find many outlets really in Blackpool other than youth clubs, and they just looked at us as if we were from Mars, playing to a bunch of 15-year-old Catholic schoolgirls who looked at us and thought, what? What is that? So we certainly didn't get into music off to a flying start in terms of winning the affiliations of young schoolgirls. That was never going to be on the cards.
I've always found that fascinating, coming from Blackpool, the idea that you, Lemmy, and Roy Harper were around at the same time. It just seems hard to imagine in my head.
Yeah. Well, I did meet Lemmy because I ended up, I always remember, and last time I saw Lemmy, which was many, many years ago, I did remind him that he still owes me £1, because when he was always broke. Lemmy never had any money and would always be trying to tap people up for a pint of beer or a bus fare or something. And I had no money either, but I lent him £1 and never got it back, of course. But what I did get, because Lemmy was actually the rhythm guitarist in Reverend Black and the Rocking Vicars, and when he had really fallen on hard times, he was forced to sell his 1960s vintage white Fender Strat back to the music store in Lytham where we all went. And I ended up taking on that Strat in sort of kind of hire purchase terms for a year or so, until I gave up playing guitar and part exchanged the Strat for a Shure Unidyne 3 microphone and for no particularly good reason, a shiny flute. So the collective total, it was maybe 60 quid worth of flute and microphone against a guitar that today would probably be worth $40,000 or $50,000. Even if you didn't know that Ian Anderson and Lemmy had both owned it. It was, it seemed like a pretty bad financial arrangement, but in fact, it was probably one of the best, deals I ever made, really, because I got a flute out of it.
Yeah, the signature piece, which at that time is a really strange thing to do, to go and get a flute in the middle of everyone's getting guitars, bass and drums, and you're going off somewhere else, which I think kind of says a lot about you, really.
Well, it said a lot about Eric Clapton and what a great guitarist he was, along with Jimmy Page and Richie Blackmore and Jeff Beck and the guys that I heard about, because I knew that I was never going to be that good, and that's what really pushed me to not abandon guitar, but as a performing instrument, then to try and find something else to play that was a bit off the beaten track. And as far as I knew, Eric Clapton, was as a flute player, he was useless. So I thought, well, I'll give that one a go. And Jimi Hendrix didn't play the flute, and Jeff Beck didn't play the flute, and so it was for no really good reason that I chose it. And in fact, I didn't get a note out of it. I bought it, I think, in July or August. I finally managed to get a note out of it in mid-December of '67, in a bleak winter, which it was, down in Luton. And I finally managed to, a note came out. Wow. And it was a note of G. And then I got a note of E and an A and a B. And suddenly I had, toss in the flattened fifth, I've got the blues scale. And because I could play a bit of guitar, within a week I could play blues solos on the flute, so it was, it came very quickly once I managed to get any kind of a noise out of it. And it turned out to be the way I played it as an untutored rank amateur, then it became forceful enough to sit side by side with the electric guitar in the early Jethro Tull, when the other guys couldn't afford very powerful amplifiers to begin with. So at least I could sort of be heard. But it was always a rough ride trying to be heard as an acoustic musician over a loud rock band. And luckily Jethro Tull, knowing which side its collective bread is buttered, has retained a tendency to be on the quiet side on stage at any rate. So we try and leave space for the intrusion of acoustic instruments into an electric world, and let the PA do the work of making it loud to the audience rather than create huge levels on stage, which then just mess everything up completely. And I know, because I've played as a guest, I've played flute with a number of people, and I've not been able to hear anything. I've been deafened by ridiculous guitars and drums and stuff. It just, couldn't be in that kind of a band. I won't mention the names of the people I'm referring to, but they just play so loudly on stage. It makes the life of the front of house sound engineer so much more difficult. The louder you are on stage, the worse it is to make that work in a theater, let alone an arena. Anyway, by the by.
That's what fascinates about a lot of your work. There's a lot of subtleties in it, and is that because it isn't bombastic, it isn't pure volume. There's nuance, texture, subtleties, and
that's right.
And with the lyrics as well. You've expanded the lexicon. There's so much going on in there. You need the space to do that, and is that key?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's just about having dynamic range, really. It's good to be loud, it's good to be quiet, it's good to be somewhere in between, it's good to be nothing, by having space between the notes you play, to let a little bit of blue sky visible through the clouds. That's what gives things perspective and depth. And I think that's one thing, again, referring to Eric Clapton, who's in my bad books at the moment for his ridiculous posturing about vaccination and masks and so on, along with his loathsome buddy Van Morrison, who again used to be my buddy. But anyway, Eric did know about the value of light and shade and space. He was never, he could play as fast as anybody, but he often played in a very melodic way. And there are beginnings and ends to phrases where you can see the space in between. That's why I think he's still stands as probably the most important electric guitarist of our time, and as being a lyrical guitar player. His guitar playing is like the human voice. It has to stop and take a breath sometimes, and that's the phrasing that made him so good. I think Jimi Hendrix did that too, but there are some guitar players who come to mind who it's just an outpouring of it's akin to something that comes out of your relaxed sphincter after a chicken vindaloo or whatever, and it just is just an unstoppable surge of stuff, and it's it overwhelms you. You can't really relax and enjoy it because it's just incessant outpouring of notes. And I know guitar players often do it because they say, okay, here's the guitar, so you got 24 bars here to play. 24 bars, right? Because you're trying to fill every nanosecond of those 24 bars. And I think, that's regrettable. Luckily, as a flute player, you do have to take a breath. And I possibly have to take more breaths now than I did when I was in my 20s. So that, phrasing comes more naturally, as it does with the human voice.
When you write lyrics, do they pour out of you, or do you work? Do you have to really craft them to get them to say what you're trying to say?
Well, I've just finished the first draft of all the lyrics for the next album for March 2023. And if I look back at what I was writing, I try and get ideas of music and ideas of words to come together, but they are quite often under the umbrella of a generalized topic. I mean, again, you could be excuse for having to use the C word, the concept album. And indeed, ultimately, I suppose that is what it is. It's coming up with an idea. Could be a title for an album. It could be a theme for an album. It could be a group of related songs that somehow, sit under that same umbrella. And then, working through the lyrics, it's little moments of, that might be something to do. And as soon as you put a few words on paper or on your computer screen, they have implications. They have meter. They have rhythm. It's implicit in the words. When you read them silently or aloud, they have cadence. They rise and fall in the way that you would speak those words. And so it implies even the beginnings of the essence of a melody, perhaps. Mm-hmm. That way, I find it evolves fairly quickly, so that maybe over the course of an hour or so, I've got some lyrics that I might go back to later that day or the next day and change a few things. But yes, it does tend to come fairly quickly, and I like to work quickly, both musically and lyrically. I like to have that energy, but I'm not afraid to go back, and if I have to edit something or rewrite something, if I feel that the essence is there, but it needs kind of rethinking a little bit, then I will do that. But by the time we get to band rehearsals, that's when it all starts to really evolve to a finite arrangement and, generally speaking, pretty fixed lyrics. So by the time we got together to record the first 7 tracks of the Zealot Gene in March of 2017, yes, it really was that long ago, we had spent 5 days rehearsing, and we had everything locked down as to how we would play it effectively live on stage. And that's the way we recorded those first 7 songs all together. I wasn't in the same room with them. I was in a corridor outside with a microphone, doing some guide vocals and shouting, second chorus, 2, 3, 4, so that they would know where they were. And with the thumping through the walls of the band playing, which meant, again, if you're singing or playing an acoustic instrument, you usually end up having to do it differently. Separately. But it was done that way, and I think then it's kind of locked down, and things are pretty much set in stone at the stage of, walking into a studio. There are very few changes would be made once we're in the studio, because we've prepped it. We've got it sorted. They had the demos in the end of February, and a couple of weeks to think about those before we had our rehearsal, and then went on the next week to record. So hopefully we can replicate that this year, depending on the periods of time between tours, and the fact that 2 of my guys, well, one of them is caught up with some other projects, and one of them has hip surgery to do, and will be out of action really for 5 weeks. So I'm somewhat constrained by having a couple of guys missing, but I really don't want to embark upon rehearsing and recording without all the people together at the same time. I really want to make it as much of a live experience as possible.
So with the lyrics, do they come first and they suggest the melodies, then the songs? Is that generally how you write?
It's the way, if something has to come first, I'd rather it was the lyrics, because writing music is pretty easy. Writing lyrics is sometimes quite hard. But writing the music, as I say, if I have to do one first, I'd rather it was the lyrics. But in an ideal world, they're kind of happening almost at the same time, even though it's just maybe 1 or 2 lines, but it's the beginning of a song, and I can just remember sitting in a hotel room somewhere in America and strumming a guitar, and with a capo on the 3rd fret and the first inversion D chord, and just thinking, followed by, and just the words in my head. I really don't mind if you sit this one out, and that was all I had for Thick as a Brig. I really don't mind if you sit this one out. An odd beginning to the first line of a song, inviting the audience to switch off and go and make the tea. But it seemed like a fun idea. And with that basic idea, you just think, okay, what's the second line? And so that's the way those things evolve in an ideal world. Same thing with a song called Budapest on Crest of a Nave. I woke up very early in the morning on the banks of the Danube at a time when I think it was 1985, maybe 86. And I was just looking out the window, and again, I had my guitar in my room, and I just played 3 chords, and I was just thinking back to the night before, and the words, I think she was a middle distance runner, which has rhythm. I think she was a middle distance runner. And then what's the second line? The translation wasn't clear. It just comes like that. So the music and the words, they come together. It's brilliant. But if forced, I'd much rather do the words first, because I'm always confident about finding music, because the words suggest music to me, whereas the music alone does not necessarily suggest any words, as Beethoven and many classical musicians would have found. They were great musicians, but they were not lyric writers, just as Tim Rice was a great lyric writer, but he wasn't a musician. And I don't think Andrew Lloyd Webber could put 3 words together. Well, he probably like me, he probably did O-level Latin, so maybe he could do it in Latin.
Yeah, could be an interesting concept. So when you talk about Zappa and emotion before, and you found his stuff wasn't always that emotional, how do you put the emotion into that? Is it from the music, or do you place emotion in the lyrics after you've written them? And it can often the emotions you place there be different from the lyrics you've written.
Well, it can be, but I think in a way, as soon as you start to think about the performance of lyrics, even if it's just singing them in the studio or to yourself, you are beginning to theatricalize the way in which you do it. It becomes, you're taking on a rather thespian way of, how am I going to sing this, and how do I inject into it even if it's a non-emotional subject, if it's just strictly observational, it's still is a Constable painting, but still you have to enunciate things and put them forward. So in a way, it is like being a bit of an actor. You are taking on a role. It's a fake, in other words, but you do it in a way that you try to make believable. And I think that's, I'm not an actor, but I'm certainly think I understand from talking to actors and listening to other people, that a lot of the way in which lyrics are expressed are, it's ramped up a little bit in the act of doing it. But I'm sure those people who write a few words on a piece of paper or whatever, and it is from the word go deeply impassioned, and it really is the way they feel. I personally think that's fine and great, but I think there are other ways to arrive at something that has emotion, particularly in the way that it's performed. And I would employ whatever is in the toolkit in order to make that come alive, even if it is taking on a character role. I mean, I can think of one song I'm playing on stage these days, and which I never played live before, partly because of the subject material being, a bit scary, but I decided it was time to do that live on stage, and I sing it because it's scary, because I'm singing it in the first person about a person who is one of the baddest people ever to walk the planet Earth, and singing that song in character is a little dangerous. It's a little bit like I'm seeing myself as that person, but I read extensively about that person and not only his place in history, but what might have been his childhood, what might have been his growing up years, how he became that person. And I felt that I didn't want to excuse it by any means. I wanted to marginally explain it, and explain his relationship with other people around him who thought he was the bee's knees. And so it's it's sometimes you take on a character role and people think you are talking about yourself, when of course you're not. You're just acting it out. And I have a lot of respect for those actors who take on scary, difficult parts like that, who play bad guys, sometimes real life bad guys, or people that are generally the character is despicably bad. And I think in a way it's a dangerous thing sometimes to do. Playing the main character in Nabokov's Lolita has been done in movie terms 3 times, and it's a pretty difficult role to take on, because to take on the role of being a pedophile, knowingly succumbing to a precocious 12-year-old lover, I don't think there'll be another movie made of Lolita, not in my or my children's lifetimes. But those were made back in the 60s, 70s, and at least one of the cases I thought was really quite beautifully done. And having read the book, of course, the book has got a little more depth and substance to it to explain how this awful thing comes about, and how it's a morality tale. I mean, it has a really bad end, for everybody concerned. And as a morality tale, I think it still deserves to be told, but it's a dangerous thing to take on that role. A dangerous thing sometimes to sing. If you're Mick Jagger singing "Sympathy for the Devil," I mean, it's just a throwaway. No one's going to take it seriously because it's just a bit of fun. But sometimes there are subjects you might choose to sing about, but you've got to be a little careful if you're pretending to be God, or you're pretending to be a particularly nefarious historical real life character. So having done those things, I am aware that some people will misunderstand it or misconstrue my reasons for doing it. But, I think somebody's got to do that stuff. And as long as you don't overstep the mark, whatever that mark is in your own mind and in your own period of time and the context, then somebody's got to do it. But it doesn't make me particularly controversial. I'm anything but controversial compared to a lot of people.
It kind of brings us full circle, really, because it's the idea that, with social media, everything is down to just 6 or 7 buzzwords, isn't it? And there's no nuance, there's no depth. It's just people shouting about.
Yeah, I've been involved with social media since its inception, really, and with first of all, with a website, and then with all the other variants and things more recently, particularly Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And I have to employ those media as tools of my trade when it comes to information giving, marketing, promotion. But in terms of a personal use of those, I don't use them at all. I absolutely, I probably have a Facebook account and a Twitter account in my own name, but only in order to stop somebody else, or minimize or reduce the risk of someone pretending to be me, which of course happens. But I never indulge in two-way or multi-way conversations with people in social media, because I know what I'm going to get. I'm going to get absolutely torn to pieces by a lot of people who just want to hurt me, and I feel like I'm some little school kid getting bullied by people who just want to do anything to ruin my day, and ultimately perhaps make me want to slit my wrists or hang myself from the curtains. It's social media can be so damaging and dangerous, and I'm afraid that after the second tumbler of single malt, if you put me on Twitter, I might make a real fool of myself. So I choose to avoid those, except for necessary stuff like tour dates and things that so many people use them and they never leave Facebook. So you've got to make sure you have a presence. But I'd much prefer people saw on Facebook, jethrotull.com, and they go to the website, because there's a whole lot more stuff and almost everything on that I have written. So I feel that's where you go if you want to know about Jethro Tull and hear really my words and sentiments, because I don't let other people write things for the website. I don't want anybody choosing to in a way make it something that it's that is not really past my test of scruples and checking facts, because for the most part I think I don't make too many factual errors on our website, but doubtless there have been some. I did actually correct one the other day, come to think of it. I was just a year out, but somebody probably pointed it out.
We'll always notice. And finally, just one quick Blackpool question. St Cleve. Now, is that a composite of St Anne's and Cleveleys, or do you want to retain
probably subconsciously it probably is, because Geoffrey Hammond and John Evans and I were Blackpool grammar school boys that got to know each other and got together as a band. And when it came to doing the album cover for Thick as a Brick, we sort of split it between us, really. John probably had less to do with it, but Geoffrey and I took on, you know, a lot of the writing of all these ridiculous stories. It was based on a kind of an inferior version of the Blackpool Gazette and Herald, or whatever it was called. It was Evening Gazette or whatever. Yeah. It was local, parochial stuff. But I thought, well, Blackpool's quite a big town. Maybe we'll pretend this is somewhere, you know, more somewhere like Poulton Le Fylde or some outlier small town or area. And so St Anne's, Cleveleys, I suppose they were somewhere in the mix. But I'm not quite sure who came up. It might have been me, might have been Geoffrey. I don't know who came up with St Cleve. But you know, we're really making a lampooning parochial England. Mm-hmm. And Roy Eldridge, who worked for Chrysalis Records at the time, was well, he had been the press officer, and I think he moved on to being A&R later. But at the time, his experiences having started out at working for a little local newspaper, and then written for Sounds, you know, in one of the UK music press at the time. You know, he had quite experience from as a journalist and writer to somehow sort of authenticate all of this, and he was also involved in the shape of it. And I think he actually didn't write anything for it, but you know, he gave us lots of ideas and notions, and we put it together that way. So yes, it has to do with you know, that sense of growing up not in a small town, because Blackpool was never a small town, but arguably if you lived in St Anne's or Lytham or Cleveleys, you know, you might have felt a degree of separation and thought of it that way. But I guess I was thinking more of Middle England or home counties, you know, some small, something more than a village, but less than a town that might have its, as they do these days, online. You know, even the village where I live, you know, has an online newspaper, which is really interesting to hear about, because people don't tend to talk to their neighbors in the way they used to. And it's a way of knowing what's going on down the street, in the next street, you know. So I quite like the fact that has made its comeback in an online version. Yeah. And there's a place for that parochial, inward-looking world that I think is sort of traditional and in a way quite endearing. Mm-hmm. However, on that note, I must leave you because my call is due in 6 minutes.
Thanks for your time.
Go and grab a coffee.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Goodbye.
Cheers. Yeah. Take care. Bye-bye now.